I don't think Rusyns can ever be recognized in Ukraine, and I don't think Rusyns and Ukrainians will ever be able to live in harmony, at least until one of us changes our national ideology. This may sound hyperbolic, pessimistic, however, watch until the end of this video. By then, I think many of you will agree with that opinion. We have pondered as a people on the question of Ukrainian influence and Ukrainian identity for about 100 years now, a century. In that time, we have rarely looked at the underlying attributes that have created the situation, that have led to Rusyn erasure, have led to the oppression that hundreds of thousands of Rusyns experience now. It's uncomfortable to talk about these things. However, if we wish to fight back against Rusyn erasure, if we want to ever try to reach our maximum potential, we need to understand where exactly we are. What is causing our oppression? Without that, no change can ever be made. With that said, it is dangerous to put this out, and it does worry me a bit, the outcome, the reaction to this. But it must be done. Someone must do it, and I'm going to do that today in this video. So, where do we begin? The Rusyn and Ukrainian problem. The issue of Rusyn-Ukrainian relations is fundamentally an issue relating to ideology. From here, all problems to do with territorial sovereignty, nationhood, and history are born. What does that mean? That means that the Rusyn ideology and the Ukrainian ideology are in perpetual conflict. And the Rusyn people and the Ukrainian people have different interests, different narratives that cannot mesh together. They're fundamentally opposed to each other. Well, what exactly do I mean in more detail? Well, I like to think of Ukrainian ideology as a pan-ruthenian one. On the left, you have the map sent by the Ukrainian delegation to the 1919 Paris Peace Conference after World War I, advocating for the creation of a Ukrainian state. And on the right, you have the Western Ukrainian People's Republic. Now, what's interesting about these maps, regardless of Carpathian Rus being included, is that it includes all of the historical area of Ruthenia and the imperial possessions or imperial conquests of the Ruthenian Cossacks. Zaporizhian Cossacks in what is now southeastern Ukraine, the Kuban area. What you are seeing here, and what I think is perhaps not exactly clear on first look, but is that the Ukrainian idea has always been in the sense of uniting all Ruthenians under one state, under one national identity. It is why, when we say we are Rusyns, they say, well, Rusyn was just an old name for Ukrainian. Ruthenian is synonymous with Ukrainian. And every single territorial conquest or territorial ambition has been through the idea of connecting Ruthenia and any conquests done by Ruthenians. Now, Belarusians, as many of you might know, and as I've said before in other videos, they were also Ruthenians too. However, it is a little bit complicated in their case because there's the whole Litvan thing, the association with Lithuania. However, we can see that fundamentally, just from this alone, from the statements and from the nationalist ambitions going back now over a century ago, and if you actually read the writings of Ukrainian nationalists, both modern and historic, you will begin to see that they see Ruthenia as Ukraine. There is no difference between these two. It is why, when you actually look at the way Ukraine presents historical figures, any Ruthenian figures are essentially labeled as Ukrainian figures, even if it was in the 1500s and nobody identified as Ukrainian back then. It is pervasive across all levels of society, and it is the bedrock. And with that too, Ukrainian identity is fundamentally in opposition to Russia. It is fundamentally in opposition to Russian identity, to the Russian claim to the Rus. It is why we see so often now in propaganda talking about how Moscow was a swamp and how Kiev and Ukraine are the rightful heirs to the Kievan Rus. They see Russia as a pretender of sorts. And, you can get into this kind of weird, strange ethnic ideology and kind of racialist viewpoint, but take these pictures, do your own research, but you will find that essentially anything Ruthenia is synonymous with Ukraine in the minds of Ukrainians. And so, how is this in direct opposition to us? Well, we view Carpathian Rus as the national, or we can say the national vision of Carpathian Rus as a state for the Rus of the Carpathians, or as the nation of the Rus of the Carpathians. And again, if we do not wish to join the Ukrainian ideology, the Ukrainian national identity, this means that not all Ruthenians are Ukrainians. This means that it is a choice, not just what is. It fundamentally changes the question of, well, if these carpatho-rusyns are not Ukrainians, then, and even though they were, Ruthenians, and they still use the word Rusyn, well, then what is keeping everyone else together? What is keeping the people in the Donbass or southeastern Ukraine from choosing to not be Ukrainian? Or what gives us authority over all the lands of Ruthenia? The legitimacy of Ukraine to control all of Ruthenia is therefore broken down. It starts to disintegrate. I really want to tell you a little bit of how this is different from all the other countries we've lived in, because I think it's important to kind of contrast the differences here and why our experiences with assimilation with other countries is nothing compared to Ukraine, and why the idea that them joining the EU will suddenly make them recognize Rusyns, or why if we just have them be a democracy, things can suddenly work out. The reality is that this is not the case. And so, think of it like this. In Hungary, when they attempted to modularize us, they did not wish to integrate our language, our national figures, our identity into their own national consciousness. They wished to replace our language, our identity with their own. And this is the same with Slovakia, with Poland, with Romania. They don't see Rusynness as an integral part of their national spirit. They simply wished, in many cases, just to have us become Poles, have us to become Slovaks, have us to become Romanians. This is a very different thing than saying that Rusyns are part of us. They are fundamentally a part of our national history, and we must incorporate them. We must appropriate their national heroes, their language, their culture into us, and turn it into, for example, from Rusyn culture to Transcarpathian culture or Transcarpathian Ukrainian culture. The Rusyn language to a very weird Transcarpathian dialect of Ukrainian. These two are fundamentally different, and instead of a simple conflict of assimilation or a majority group versus a minority group, the bedrock differences or the bedrock conflict between Rusyns and Ukrainians is one of ideology. Now, going back to Ukraine for a second, I think it's important to talk about the legitimacy of Ukrainian statehood, and we can get more into the politics of Ukraine today, but this map here, it doesn't really matter what it's talking about. I'm sure you can see it's a political map, Svoboda, in Galicia. I'm sure you can assume for the educated viewers what this map entails if you can't read Cyrillic. But fundamentally, this pan-Ruthenian idea is linked to Ukraine, to the Ukrainian state, fundamentally. It is the ideology which keeps it together. The reality is much more different from ideology, though, in that we know, at least in the Donbass and in Crimea, but also in many places in southeastern Ukraine, they don't have this strong association with pan-Ruthenianism, of Ukrainianness being anti-Russian, or being the heirs to the Kievan Rus only. This is simply not seen there. And there's even differences between Galicia and the far west and central Ukraine. When we think about modern geopolitics, we have to understand that not only do we have this ideology, but which was important when Ukraine was divided. It was not an actual state. Ukrainians were living in 4 different countries. It was important then. But now we add in territorial integrity, state sovereignty, a national ideology within a state. This takes on a whole new level of seriousness. And it's a thing of where not only is pan-Ruthenianism a type of force to finally fit everyone together, but now it also has to be a thing which keeps everyone together. If we say, hey, we are not Ukrainians, and we do not necessarily want to be part of the Ukrainian project, then this gives a scenario where many other places would, I think, not be willing to be part of that project as well, or at least that is the fear. And fear is a very strong motivator, as we all know. And so this is something we have to take into account of this national ideology paired with modern geopolitics of a state that has been at war for not just a year and a half, it's been at war since the rebels in the Donbass, since Crimea. And to back all this, these nationalist Ukrainian movements have been funded by the West since before World War II. It is no coincidence that many of the people in the OUN, in these other extreme nationalist organizations, somehow ended up in Canada, somehow ended up in Germany, in America. Somehow, very well-funded organizations have been able to keep going for 70 years. It's not because of donations every Sunday that they're able to stay open. I think we all know that there's certain actors behind the scenes involved with this. At the end of the day, though, there's also another issue in this, and I think it connects with national ideology, it connects with territorial integrity and sovereignty. It connects these two together, but it also fundamentally attacks more of the baseline assumptions that Ukrainians hold. And what do I mean by this? Well, the Karpatska Sich, they are seen as heroes in much of nationalist Ukraine. They are the people that helped draw in Subcarpathia to the Ukrainian state. They helped initiate the eventual annexation of Carpathia to Soviet Ukraine. And this, therefore, legitimizes the action of that annexation. It legitimizes ripping away 800,000 Rusyns from their brethren in Pryayshiv It rips them, it justifies that ripping them away and incorporating them into the Ukrainian state. This, of course, is something where, if this is false, if Rusyns are not Ukrainians, well, think of the outcome of that. Think of that, instead of national heroes, well, they begin to look a lot more like oppressors, or wannabe conquerors in some sense, that have gone into an area that does not want to be annexed, does not want to assimilate to their ideology, and effectively takes over the government from the rightful people who are leading the autonomous region of Podkarpatska Rus. It essentially overthrows them and sets in their own government. And of course, if Rusyns are not Ukrainians, and if the Karpatska Sich are not heroes, then what legitimacy does the annexation of Subcarpathia have? And what does that mean for the current day when the annexation was not legitimate for any reason? What does that mean for the future of Subcarpathia being within Ukraine? So to recap, what is in this conflict? Well, the Ukrainians wish to keep pan-ruthenianism alive, partially because their national ideology depends on it, but also because of territorial integrity and retaining the image of national heroes and justifying the annexation of Subcarpathia. These are all linked. They are not separate in any way, but they are just distinct enough to be their own point. Now, what's in it for Rusyns? Well, of course, we wish to have a legitimization of the Rusyn identity. We wish to be taken seriously because we are a unique and distinct people. It's not because we are trying to make it so, it's because we are so. And external forces are now coming down onto us and saying, no, you are not legitimate, even though we all know this is the case, that we are. The ability for our autonomy within our own area, to be able to make some decisions for ourselves, to be able to say, yes, I want to have some say in what direction my people go. I want to be able to have our people decide some things for ourselves. This is something that we do not have. And of course, saving our own national heroes. Because if the Karpatska Sich and the annexation were right, the actions of Maxim Sandovich, of Dobryansky, of Duknovich, they were wrong then. Because let's not forget, many of these people were Rusnophiles, Russophiles. Their ideas, in most cases, were in direct opposition to Ukrainian identity or Ukrainian interests. And so, if the Ukrainian national heroes were right, then ours, what does that make us? It's a question perhaps you should think on. But to recap clearly, if Rusyns are allowed, then there is no justification for their annexation. Their heroes in the Karpatska Sich were nothing more than ultranationalists who wished to unrightfully assimilate another ethnic group, and the ideals of pan-ruthenianism die. There is no way forward for Rusyn sovereignty except in a way that significantly restructures what it means to be Ukrainian. Because of this, internalized subjugation and Rusyn erasure, things we have already covered, must always be present so as to not risk this outcome. You see, the rights of Rusyns, to be able to be a legitimate people, this is not an issue of giving a minority some rights. This is a fundamental problem for the Ukrainian soul, for the Ukrainian vision. And because of this, there is no way that our interests, our nation, can be in harmony with the Ukrainian interests, with the Ukrainian vision, unless one of us changes. And until that day occurs, we will continue to have the same problems. We will continue to fight the same battles, ideologically, spiritually, intellectually. But no matter how many things we do on the side, unless this is solved, nothing else really matters. And maybe it can't be solved. And then you have to answer for yourself what you're going to do then. But if you want to help fix this problem of Rusyn and Ukrainian relations, don't think about it in terms of Ukraine is not a democracy. Don't think about it in terms of a minority group that needs to fight for its rights. Think about it in terms of national ideology. Once you do, everything will begin to make more sense. And with that, I'll see you next time.